Hi, and welcome back to Management Information Systems. This is Module 9, and we're going to talk about automating worksheet tasks. So, some of the things we're going to talk about in this module are how to plan a macro, enable a macro, record a macro, run a macro, edit a macro, keyboard shortcuts for macros, using the personal macro workbook, and assign a macro to a button. So let's talk a little bit about what a macro is. It's really a set of instruction that automates a task. As far as macro planning guidelines, you need to assign a macro a descriptive name, and this is just like best practices so that you can remember exactly what this macro does. They suggest you give it a descriptive name. Write out the steps, decide how you're going to perform the actions, practice steps, and determine where you're going to have the macro location. So here's an example of planning a macro. So what this is, it's to create a stamp for this particular company's headquarters location. And what it's doing is it has a descriptor. Of course, it has a name that is very descriptive. There's a description, and then these are the steps that are going to be taken. So a description of a macro, they're showing you some description names. Like Joe Cats or footer stamp or add totals. These are great descriptive names for macros. Something that you need to think about is macros can contain viruses. So by default, macros are disabled. So if you save a macro enabled workbook, it will be called an XLSM extension. So when you're looking at it, that's what you're going to see as the extension. Here is an example of how to enable a macro. So you would go through the Excel options dialog box, and this is how you would go about turning those macros on. You can also disable macros. When you're not using macros, you should disable them because it's more of a security thing than anything else because they can contain viruses. So if you're not using them, disable them. You click on the developer tab and then you click on macro security button in the code group, and you have three options. You can disable without a notice, disable with notification, or only allow digitally signed macros to run. So there's the security, that extra layer of security that you would be adding. The Excel macro recorder creates program code as the steps are executed. So it does exactly what it says. It actually creates the steps in order for a macro to function. So you click on the record macro button, you name the macro, and you enter the keystrokes or the executable commands, and then you click stop. And what it does is it creates that automation for you. So here's what the record macro box dialog box looks like. And so you're going to go through the steps of giving it a name. You could give it a shortcut key. In this case, they're not. And they're saying, okay, store the macro in this particular workbook. And then you would go ahead and put a description in. When you run a macro, you can run it manually. You can test it, and I suggest you do test it to make for sure that it works correctly, or you can run automatically when the workbook opens. And what you would have to do is name the macro auto open and save it in the workbook. So here's the macro dialog box. So this is an existing macro that already exists that's been created, And here's an example of using that dialog box to manually run that macro. So when you have macros, you have program code, which are the instructions that are a part of the steps that are taken in the macro to complete an automated process. The type of programming that's used for this is Visual Basic for Applications, or VBA, and you've probably heard of that before. A module is the program code container attached to the workbook. Visual Basic Editor is the macro editing program, and the comments part of it are the explanatory text. And they are preceded by an apostrophe. That's how you know that they're just explanatory text. So here's the Visual Basic Editor. And when you go in and take a look at the Visual Basic Editor, of course you have on this side, this is actually the code that's running. Oops, let me go back. This is the code that it is running or the Visual Basic code that's running when you set up a macro. There's also keyboard shortcuts. You can run a combination of macros using a keyboard shortcut. You can assign a keyboard shortcut, but you have to also be thinking about being careful when you're choosing the letters. I usually choose not to use keyboard shortcuts only because I use shortcuts for other things, and I don't want to accidentally enable a macro when I'm doing a shortcut. So it's a matter of a preference. So here's how you would go about, and we took a look at this before, recording a macro. And this is in the dialog box, and this is using a shortcut key. As you can see, it's Control-Shift-R. So when you do assign keyboard shortcuts, by default, Excel records absolute cell references in those macros. If you want to use relative cell referencing, then you have to use click and use the relative references button on the developer tab. So when you're hearing me talk about this, you're probably panicking and saying, oh my goodness, how am I going to know how to do this? Looks very complicated. I'm going to put a couple of videos in that will show you how to use macros. And I think it will become easier as you go through the assignments and as you get to see these videos on how you go about using macros. So a personal macro workbook is basically something that you can use to store your personal macros, and it is something that is available to you if you want to have your personal macro workbook. And I would say that you should have one. If you have a macros that you're developing, you should use a workbook to put all of those macros into so that you have an area where you know they can be reused, and it's just a really nice thing to have. So here's another example of using the macro workbook. And what they're doing is they're actually creating a macro, and they're saying this is where I want to store it. And in this case, in this workbook is where they want to store this particular macro. So you have a lot of options when it comes to this. You can, if you went up to, you could save it in your workbook. But if you just will never use it again and you don't want to save it in your workbook, your personal macro workbook, you can just save it within the workbook that exists that you're working in. So if in working with the personal macro workbook, what happens is it will open automatically each time you start Excel. You can delete unwanted macros. If you have created a new macro that works better and you want to get rid of the old one, you can certainly do that. You can hide the file in an active workbook, and to do that you click on the View tab and then click on Hide. If you're unable to record to the workbook, check to be sure the file is enabled. That's one of the tricks is click the File tab, click Options, click Add-ins, click Manage, List Rows, and click Disabled Items, and then click Go. And then you would click on the name and make for sure that it's enabled, so that perhaps that's your problem as to why you're not able to use a particular macro. Macros can be assigned to a user-created button, and you just click on the button to run the macro. So here's the result of running a particular macro. And here is the button. So you have a button that's within the worksheet that you have. You click on it and it will run the macro. So when I say you create a button, you actually create a button in the worksheet. In this case, it's called HQ macro. You have the ability to assign a macro to that button. In order to do that, you use what's called a form control. So this would be an example of assigning it to a button. You would click on the Developer tab, click the Insert button, click the desired control, and then draw the shape. Link the control to the worksheet cells and assign settings in the Form Control dialog box. Again, this sounds really complicated, but once you do it a couple times, it will make sense. And I will see you in the next module. Thank you.